This. Good afternoon. It is so fabulous to see all of you here today on this, beautiful April afternoon. April may be the cruelest month, but it's also the most poetic month, especially because we're having a fabulous reading today by George Bilger. Without further ado, I will introduce the marvelous Grace Cavalieri, and she will introduce the poet. Thanks for coming.
Thank you again, St. John's and Bruce Douglas, for giving us a room in the house where people can come and feed the flame and keep poetry going. Thank you for that. Well, thank you, my co-host, poet and co-publisher of Annapolis Home magazine, the Vogue of the East Coast. And it is a gorgeous magazine. So she's a poet as well as an editor. And what's her name? Her name is Kimberly Taylor. And her first book is coming out in May. Anyway, she is a poet. Now, George comes to us from Ohio, where he is a teacher at John Carroll University. And he has 9 books of poetry. The last are, I think, Central Air from the University of Pittsburgh and Cheap Motels of My Youth, which is both are available for you for a book signing after this. He has won the Rattle Best National Award for this last book, Cheap Motel, and it was the Reader's Choice. Now, he has really won so many awards that I won't mention them, but I will mention the May Swenson Award, which is a covetous national prize. And we'd be here very late if I listed all of them. He lives in Cleveland with his wife, Jody, and 2 marvelous children that we met yesterday. George has really made a great contribution to poetry through the years, not only for teaching, but he does now publish a newsletter every day with his favorite poem on it and a delightful commentary. And it is, I think most of you have received it. Also, he has a radio program, that's called Poetry Town, by the way. And if you wanted the link to that, I will give it to you. Now, he has a radio program called Word Play for about 10 years, where he talks about his favorite poems with his buddy, who's also a poetry lover. And it's very funny and very erudite and funny. And I don't want to take any time away from him, but I want to say one thing, that we all have poetry in our lives. We all have comedy. We all have tragedy. But George Bilger puts them together in poetry that makes you ache while you're laughing. And that is why he is one of America's most beloved poets. We are so lucky he came to Annapolis. Here's George.
What an intro. Thank you. Thank you, Grace Cavalieri. Thank you. And thanks to Kim Taylor as well, and thanks to St. John's College for having me here and hosting me today. I just have to say, you've got an amazingly beautiful campus, and I had a chance to walk through and look at it a little bit, and I know something of the history of the school, and you students here are just so lucky to be at a place like this. Wow. Well done. I'm going to start. There are only 2 jokes that you can tell about poetry readings, and I'm going to tell both of them at the beginning of this reading. One of them is, nothing lasts forever, except a poetry reading. That's one. And the other is, along the same lines of brevity, it's poetry night at the Florence Poetry Club, and the special guest tonight is Dante. And he goes up to the microphone, has a sip of water, and says, I won't keep you long. I'll just read 3 poems. So I'm sort of the world's oldest pretty new dad. I have an 8-year-old son and a 12-year-old. And as all parents know, having children reminds you of your own childhood. And when my older son, Michael, turned 9, there was something about his being 9 that reminded me of just what it is to be a 9-year-old kid. And this poem came out of that realization. 9. I'm standing by the pop machine at a gas station, drinking a root beer. It cost a dime, my whole allowance. My bike, a J.C. Higgins 3-speed, looks cool. I just washed it and waxed the blue fenders. Grown-ups are moving around me in kind of a fog. Actually, I feel sorry for grown-ups with their neckties, their dark jackets, their serious talk. I am wearing low-top kids. Their shoes are hard and gigantic. Try climbing a tree in those shoes. How am I supposed to know that an old white-haired guy, a grown-up, is watching me from his desk in the future, writing down every move I make? Why would anybody even do that? If there's one thing I don't like, it's writing. Writing in division. This root beer is actually excellent. It's a hot day. My fenders are waxed. Thank you. So, many years ago, I taught at the University of Denver, and I was a typical English professor and still am, kind of a nerdy guy. I love classical music, nice white wine. In short, a very boring person to younger people. But there was one thing about me that made me slightly less dull, and that was that I had a big motorcycle in those days. And I would go driving across the West in the summer out to Santa Cruz, California to visit my sister on my big old Harley. And that was my only claim to, it's kind of like remote coolness. And this poem is about those days. It's called Biker. I was due for a shower, so I pulled up to a little motel, the Wagon Wheel or some such, in some dusty Nevada town. And as I trudged across the parking lot with my leather boots and bomber jacket, my red bandana and scruffy beard, the big old Harley cooling in the sun, I saw behind the motel office window a pale, slender arm reach down and turn the vacancy sign around to no vacancy. Oh, owner of the pale, slender arm, I have not forgotten you. Now, from 30 years down that desert highway, from this life of subcommittee meetings and colonoscopies, not to mention mortgage payments and dental bills, braces for both kids, I'd just like to say thank you. Thank you for finding me unkempt and possibly smelly, and for making me feel, however briefly, badass. This is a poem for my wife, Jody. Some of you here, some men here may have had the extraordinary experience, possibly the most extraordinary experience you can have of watching your child actually being born at the hospital. And that happened to me one time. And as I say, I can't think of anything else in my life that was more astonishing and beautiful and moving. But it's not necessarily like that for everyone else in that room. And that's what this poem is about. It's called Push. I'm trying to look as if I'm suffering. I have this anguished expression on my face, but it's wasted since I'm wearing a surgical mask. And anyway, the focus here is really on my wife, and the doctor is right there between her legs, and he's shouting, "Push!" And my wife is doing this astounding thing. She's pushing yet another human being into the world, a world that so far seems to be pushing back, and the baby's heartbeat is down to 90, so the doc says, well, I think maybe one more try, and then we do a cesarean. So things in the room are really a bit tense. It's definitely a moment that demands a lot of attention, and my wife is gathering whatever shreds of strength remain in the shaking, exhausted sleeve of flesh her body has become, the blood and sweat and fluids everywhere, and this is it. When I hear the attending nurse standing just behind me saying to this guy in scrubs standing next to her, I think he's the anesthesiologist's assistant, well, just because Karen says she has a boyfriend doesn't necessarily mean she won't go out with you. And the guy says, his voice rising because my wife really is screaming quite loudly at this point, he says, yeah, okay, I guess I should give it a try. I mean, what's the worst that can happen other than getting shot down and looking like a total fool? And the nurse says, as the doctor is shouting, push! She says, yeah, but hasn't it been like a long dry spell for you? Aren't you getting a little desperate here? And the guy laughs, and my wife screams again, and the doctor says, yes! And into the world comes the bloody head, followed by the naked, lovely, bloody little boy, insanely ill-prepared for any of this. And I guess the guy actually is going to ask Karen out. And I say, go for it. For my dad, a poem about being young and looking up at the mystery of your own father and his strange grown-up life. The poem is called Taking Out the Trash. And have any of the men here, any of you ever had a shave with a straight razor and lather and the strop and all that stuff? That's pretty much gone away. I had it done once a few years ago just to try it, and it's absolutely luxurious. And my dad, like a lot of dads of the 50s, did that every morning. Taking out the trash. I remember as a child watching my father take out the trash at the frozen crack of dawn, cursing as he dragged the stinking cans to the curb, and thinking, that's not something I'm ever going to do. In other ways, I was a model son, standing at the mirror as he shaved, dabbing the warm cream on my cheek, dreaming of a razor and whiskers of my very own. Watching him light up a cigarette as he read the Sunday paper, one eye squinted against smoke and bad news, had me reading the funnies before I could even read. My eye squinted against nothing. And the deft, one-handed way he straightened his fedora's brim, while at the same time adjusting the coordinates of rake and tilt, makes me regret that the hat, like my father, has vanished, along with the strop and razor, the lathery bowl of curds. Even smoking and the Sunday newspaper are on the way out. These are the losses I'm mourning this morning as I drag the stinking trash cans to the curb. I was talking to Grace about this. My own writing practice involves walking down the street to a local cafe every morning and sitting there with a cup of coffee and doing my writing. I just prefer being in a cafe to being in my office, maybe because if you're at a cafe, there's always a chance you'll get interrupted by some friend and you won't actually have to do any work. It doesn't always happen, but I was at a cafe last summer, and I kept seeing this particular couple come in, and something really struck me about them, and I wrote this poem called Arrival. I've seen that couple before. Mid-70s, I'd say, trim and gray, arrived here from a good life. They give off that we know what we're doing vibe, that sense of a fine journey behind them, full of kids and grandkids, dinner parties on the patio, summers in the south of France, and some very skillful navigation through all kinds of weather that got them here safely. A little fly-blown, it must be said, but that's the 70s for you. One day he said to her, "There's this nice little cafe, good coffee. The toasted bagel with cream cheese is outstanding. It's about half a century from here. Why don't we go there together, and I'll read the Times, and you can kind of gaze off dreamily as the people pass by with your fabulous, dreamy gaze, now and then taking a sip of your cappuccino." "Okay," she said. And that's how it happens. This is a poem for women and this remarkable thing they do or can do that men cannot do. The poem is called Multitasking, and it too is set at a cafe. Multitasking. The pregnant young woman at the next table is checking out her phone while at the same time crafting a delicate little skull, a couple of eyes, and two beautifully sculpted ears, not to mention a spleen and gallbladder. She's finished the tiny trip hammer heart going lickety-split, so she texts her mom while focusing quite intensely on colon, rectum, etc. And the stomach is just about wrapped up, but there's still plenty of work to be done on the spine, all those little bones, and the central nervous system with its confounding spaghetti of wiring. And now she orders an espresso before getting back to the toes, the feet. Jesus, how many bones does it take to build somebody? But it's okay, no sweat. She's actually enjoying it. And now she texts her husband, wine, Cheetos, pickles. Okay. She shouldn't be drinking, but it's just one glass at dinner, and all I've done at my table is read the obits, while she's already finishing up the brain, which is always a challenge. Thank you. This is a poem for my mom, my father died when I was only 10, and my mom was left a single mom raising 3 kids. And she did an amazing job, I think. She worked as a nurse, and she would come home from a double shift absolutely exhausted. And what she loved to do after dinner, making dinner, was read. She was a voracious reader of the classics. And this poem is called Anna Karenina, the great Tolstoy novel. And I mentioned a few characters. One of them you may have forgotten. Eleanor Dashwood is a character from Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Anna Karenina. My mother was long dead before I was old enough to ask her who she was. But I'm reading Anna Karenina, which I recall her burning through late nights after a double shift, after the insertion of suppositories and the emptying of bedpans, after she fried us up some pork chops and opened a can of applesauce and a can of hominy and a can of fruit cocktail. She'd sit down with her cigarettes and red wine and read these big novels that took her away from thinking all day about money and going into whatever Emma Bovary or Eleanor Dashwood was dealing with. She disappeared into French winters. She walked down London streets or sat quietly with Anna in her parlor. I look around in the novel for her cigarettes tonight, her glass of wine, anything she might have left behind. And that is a strange thing, isn't it? I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but you read a novel that someone close to you has read years and years ago, and you're taking the same journey they did, walking down the same streets, sitting in the same rooms, having the same loves and disappointments. It's a rather wonderful idea. Let me ask, how many people here have won a MacArthur Genius Grant? Let's see. Am I the only one? Let's see. Okay. It's a lonely feeling. So no, I have not won a MacArthur. If you don't know what it is, a Genius Grant is the MacArthur Foundation. There are two things that are great about it. First, they give you $500,000, which I don't need. I teach. The second is everyone has to call you a genius now. So it's like I can see my wife, weren't you supposed to take out the kitty litter, genius? Isn't it your turn to dump the garbage, genius? However, I did have a kind of a close call, and that's what this poem is about. It's called Genius. It was nice being a genius, worth $500,000 for the 2 or 3 minutes it took me to walk back to my house from the mailbox, the letter from the foundation trembling in my hand. Frankly, for the first minute, I was somewhat surprised at being a genius. I'd only published a couple of things at that point. I didn't even have a book. I was just a part-time lecturer at a small Midwestern college. But early into the second minute, I had fully embraced the fact of my genius. I mean, these guys know what they're talking about, right? Who am I to tell the foundation its business? And I was already rehearsing the modest, hey, it's no big deal tone of voice I'd be using on the phone for the rest of the day as I called all my friends, and especially my enemies, to share the good news. But when I opened the letter and found it was merely a request for me to recommend someone else to be a genius, I lost interest and made myself a ham sandwich. And I just want to say there are a lot of writers in this room, and if you ever get to the end of a poem you're writing and you can't figure out how to end it, that line, I made myself a ham sandwich, it always works. Any poem. You could end Paradise Lost with that. So give it a try. So one of the great themes of poetry, of course, is aging. And I seem to be aging, so I've got a poem about that. And it's in, let's see. This too at a cafe. It's called, and this is something strange to me. If you notice this, the poem is called No Problem. And what I find a bit odd is you'll be at a cafe or at a restaurant and you'll say to the wait person, do you think I could have some more water? And they will say, no problem. As if ordinarily it really is a problem to do this, but isn't that like their job? So I'm just curious about that. Here's the poem, No Problem. I sit here aging at the street-side cafe, giving off the sickly yellow odor of decay, while people walk by pretending not to notice, glancing away into the distance or down at their phones, doing their best out of politeness or shock to ignore me sitting here aging, and I don't blame them. It's hard to watch. And now the waitress, in her burning beauty, her lustrous, incandescent womanhood, walks up to me in a radiant cloud of youth and asks if I want another iced latte macchiato. But I'm aging so fast, I'm racing so quickly through time, I can barely hear her. And furthermore, I know what she really wants to say is, your aging is kind of gross, kind of a turnoff. Maybe you could go do it somewhere else, where it doesn't frighten the customers. And besides, it's not like there's anything I can do about it. And as I sit here with my skin peeling off and crumpling up like toilet paper, and my hair falling out on the table, and my teeth rotting and my bones turning to glass, and all my organs drowning in the sludge of age, I croak to her as she floats in the cool, creamy oasis of her youthful lustrousness. I do manage to croak, yeah, another iced latte macchiato would be great. And from the far side of the universe, from the beautiful, bountiful, burning galaxy of her late teens, she says to the fast decaying, maybe starting to smell bad, just about to be covered with flies, old leathery carcass I'm becoming, she says, no problem, except that there is actually a problem. Okay. This is a serious poem. It's about my father who died when I was quite young of alcoholism. He had a terrible drinking problem, and my childhood, the childhood of my sisters, and those years for my mother were spent dealing with that uncontrollable monster that had seized him. And at readings, I always say to parents, if you want your kids to grow up to become poets, become an alcoholic. You know, that it always works. You know, then they turn to poetry to deal with it. The poem is called The Forge. I remember watching my father stop halfway up the driveway because my tricycle was blocking the way to the garage, and how he solved the problem by picking up the tricycle by the handlebars and smashing it through the windshield of our brand new family station wagon, his face red with scotch, his black tie and jacket flapping with effort, the tricycle making its way a little farther with each blow into the roomy interior of the latest model as the safety glass relented. The tricycle and the windshield, both praiseworthy for their toughness, the struggle between them somehow making perfect sense in midday on our quiet suburban street. The windshield, the anvil, the trike, the hammer, the marriage, the forge, and failure glowing in the heat, beaten and tempered, slowly taking shape. So this book, this latest book of mine, Cheap Motels of My Youth, I'm going to read the title poem from this collection. And the poem is dedicated to a particular time in my life, and maybe some of you here have gone through it. I finished my graduate degree, and now it was time. I wanted to get a job at a university. So you go to this conference called the MLA conference. You get interviewed by a bunch of schools, and then if you're lucky, they'll invite you out to their schools for an interview. And so I spent a lot of time driving all over creation, going to different schools and interviewing. And I had a beat-up old car. I had no money. I stayed in the worst possible motels, a kind of motel that I think has largely disappeared, but once was a regular feature on the highways of the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And it was a time in my life when I was going to leave one life behind, the life of the penniless, starving student, and maybe actually have a job. So it was an important transition time in my life, back in my early 30s. So this poem is for those motels, cheap motels of my youth. They lay somewhere between the sleeping in the car era and my current and probably final era, the Best Western or Courtyards Marriott era. The wigwam, log cabin, cozy comfort, highway house, starlight, the lazy A, just off the interstate, the roar of the 16-wheelers all night long, the dented tin door opening to the parking lot, the broken Coke machine muttering to itself. Color TV, free HBO, hang yourself in our spacious closets. A job interview at some lost in the middle of nowhere branch campus of some agricultural college devoted to the research and development of the soybean and related soy byproducts. 6-course teaching load, 5 of them remedial comp. Candidate must demonstrate familiarity with basic tenets of Christian faith. Chance of getting the job, 1 in 100. Lipsticked cigarette butt under the bed. Toilet seat with its paper band, sanitized for your protection. Dead roach floating in the bowl. As the free HBO flickers in the background, you stare in the cracked mirror at a face too young, too full of hope to deserve this. And you wait for the Courtyard Marriott era to arrive. And thank God it did, and I do indeed stay in Courtyard Marriotts. So back to the theme of aging. I am aging and therefore had to get cataract surgery a couple of years ago. I don't know if any of you have been through it, but really it's a kind of miraculous thing because everyone who has it has waited too long. You're seeing the world kind of through a monochromatic gauze, and you get this surgery done and your vision is totally restored in like a week. It's truly miraculous. And so I had this done. They did one eye, then they did the other eye. And after about a week, when everything kind of come into focus again, my wife said to me one day, "Would you do me a favor?" And I said, "Yeah, what?" She said, "Would you stop saying, 'oh, wow,' every 5 minutes?" It was driving her nuts. So here's the poem, Cataracts. Look at the bird bath, I say to my wife, a week after the operation. And the daisies, I mean, just look at them. Right, she says, not looking up from her phone. She's gotten used to this. Look at the moss, I say, pointing to the moss on the stones lining the flower bed. Look at the green. It's like a green fire. I mean, it's like it's burning from within. Yeah, she says, it's green. And I say to my son, look at the crocosmia, like a red flame. The what, he says, not looking up from his Nintendo Switch. I hate to interrupt, I say to my wife, but just look at that blue sky. I mean, really look. And she looks up and says, do you want a grilled cheese sandwich? And I do very much. And when the sandwich appears, I say, wow, the yellow of melted cheese. The miraculous fact of yellow in the world. How could I have failed to appreciate yellow? And she nods, and my son goes inside. And all along the Congo and in villages along the Ganges, or just down the road in broken-hearted Cleveland, there are men and women sitting in their perpetual night. But I have my beautiful wife, my sunny boy, my yellow cheese, my azure sky. I'm one of the haves. I have light. Thank you. Here's a poem in response to a question my kids have asked me. It's called How I Met Your Mother. Let me find it here. I got to find that one. I know I've got all this. Could it be in a different book? That is possible. Yeah. How I Met Your Mother. I saw her at a party. I walked up and said, "How would you feel about getting married? Buying a house, enduring the agony of childbirth a couple of times, watching a lot of Netflix together, dining out." I'm thinking specifically of the Osso Buco at Ruggeri's, getting a dog, negotiating mortgages, and finally sitting by me in those last days, arranging the funeral, tidying up, then starting your strange new life, the one without me. How does that sound? And she sipped her mojito and said, "What are we waiting for?" I'm going to read, thank you so much. I'm going to read two more poems. This is from my son, Michael. Knock wood, but both of my kids have only been to the emergency room once. Michael, because of what I describe in this poem, and Alex, who was in the emergency room because his grandmother had cut her hand with a knife. Alex got injured in the emergency room and was taken to the emergency room. He fell off a chair. So if you're going to get injured, make sure you're in an emergency room. It's the perfect place. This poem is called The Scar, and I mentioned the word Phidian, and Phidias was an ancient Greek sculptor noted for the beauty and delicacy of the busts of the human head he sculpted. The Scar. My son slipped on the ladder by the pool and smacked his head, blood pooling on his small shoulders, the doctor stitching him whole. 3 years on, after a haircut, the scar still rises. A quarter moon a woman will ask about as they lie there one night, her fingers in his hair, her voice in his ear, the secret delight of him, a bit like burnt toast, in her nostrils as she takes his strangeness into her. What she won't know is how the frail Phidian skull I held that day in my hands resounded on the hot concrete. It echoed all summer, less like an egg cracking in a bowl or a world breaking than the wild beating of love against my heart. Dear girl who will one day win him, that part of the boy is mine. And a final poem today, and thank you for being such a wonderful and generous audience. I'm going to write a poem about something I first did with one of my kids, and then later did with my other kid, but I doubt if I could do it with either kid now. And maybe some of this happened to you when you were children. The poem is called Weather. My father would lift me to the ceiling in his big hands and ask, "How's the weather up there?" And it was good. The weather of being in his hands, his breath of scotch and cigarettes, his face smiling from the world below. "Oh, Daddy," was the lullaby I sang back down to him as he stood on earth, my great white-shirted father, home from work, his gold wristwatch and wedding band gleaming as he held me above him for as long as he could before his strength failed. Down there in the world, I find myself standing in tonight, my own little boy, looking down from his flight below the ceiling, cradled in my hands, his eyes wide and already staring into the distance beyond the man, asking him again and again, "How's the weather up there?" Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, George. Yeah, thank you so much. We're going to hand out a poem of George's and welcome you to ask questions.
Should I stand there? Okay. I will discuss questions, and I know there are no answers. Hi, yeah.
So, something I noticed about your poetry is it's very conversational and colloquial.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you decide to place line breaks.
That's a good question, because I'm perfectly well aware that if I was giving this reading during, let's say, the Renaissance, I would just have read to you 14 sonnets, and you would know exactly when the line would break because we'd come to our 10th syllable. And we don't do that anymore. Lots of poets are still writing in form in the United States, and form, received form, will never go away. Free verse is kind of a different critter. How I shape my poems comes from a sense of, I want it to sound like conversational English, but somehow heightened and cleaned up and perfected in a way. And if you look at my poems, my lines almost always break on strong words, words that will evoke an image, words that have some solidity and substance to them. I know of a lot of poets who will break lines on words that don't have any meaning, that are like verbal glue, words like I would never break a line on the word of or the. I would simply, it's not in my DNA to be able to do that. I know of poets who do that deliberately to try to, I think, kind of demystify the poem, but I don't want to do that. So I look for units of line, a unit of line within the sentence. And I feel like I can hear that. And I feel like I break my lines at a place that makes sense to the reader. I think I could probably be better about using surprising line breaks and enjambment, but I think my poems tend to look pretty traditional on the page. And if you go through any of my books and just look down the right side, you'll see unsurprising line breaks. I'm noted for my unsurprising line breaks. I excel at that. So yeah, that's important to me, that I break it in what feels like the right spot. And again, it's not going to be a weak word, a word without meaning or substance. So it's an interesting question, and I can't tell you how many times at readings people have come up and said, I liked what you read, but it sounded kind of like prose. And guilty as charged. I think in some ways it does. It's kind of what poets seem to be doing now. I like giving myself the test of writing in form, writing a villanelle, writing the diabolically fiendish, difficult sestina or a sonnet. But I'm not much good at it. I know poet friends who have a marvelous ability to, what I say, put the language in places where it doesn't want to go. The English language doesn't naturally fall into a villanelle. And being able to do that is a wonderful gift that I don't happen to have. How about you? Do you write poems?
I do, yeah.
And are you drawn to free verse or to?
Yeah, I primarily write free verse, and I'm one of the people you mentioned who I like to have deliberately jarring line breaks.
And I like that too. I like that. For some reason, it's just not my approach. But you can poets. The poetic bag of tricks is very small, and you got to take advantage of everything you can to wring as much as you can out of the language. And a really effective line break can make a whole poem.
Thank you.
George, it's not a question. I just wanted to share with you that the lady who designed the poster for this event, her first take on it was based on reading The Forge. And it is incredibly different. It's a black background with shattered glass.
Oh, wow.
And I thought it's really striking. And then I told her that the whole thing is not about this poem.
Yeah.
So she started to read other things and came up with this very playful,
Yeah.
colorful image that was just, the difference is just, I wanted to share that with you. So
Thank you, because I love the poster. I really admire that poster. I'm going to take one home and put it in my office. I like poems that are funny and witty and surprising. I like poems that are up to some kind of mischief, but I also like poetry that's utterly serious. For me, the best thing, the greatest satisfaction I take in a poem, sorry microphone, is writing a poem that is somehow manages to be both funny and serious at the same time. And that poem, The Forge, is a little uncharacteristic in that it's just a serious poem. So I can see how she'd be a little misled by that poem.
You're talking about the poet's bag of tricks, and one of the things that I noticed is you do have great last lines, and I think we all look for that as the payoff for a
Yeah.
poem. And I wondered how much you work and rework your poetry as you're writing poems.
Well, the last line is kind of a trademark thing for me. I don't feel the poem is finished until that final line somehow. It has been commented on before, the relationship between short lyric poems and jokes as very economical language machines that have very little time to do their business and deliver a kind of payoff. And I feel that way in my poems. I want them to be short, taut, economical, and like the joke moves toward the punchline that turns around everything you have just heard and makes you rethink it. And I look for that punchline, and I will keep looking for it till I find it, and it may take a long time. If I don't find it, the poem just stays in my notebook. And at the same time, I don't want to say I need to do that for every poem, but I do want that kind of taut structure held together by some sort of tension leading to the release of that last line. I write very few long, many-page sort of discursive poems. That's just not my strength. So that's how it's done.
It's interesting you said that last thing, because I was going to comment on how a lot of your poems maintain a kind of unity of time and place, which is a kind of a lyric thing.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, is in putting together your books, you have a larger idea in mind? I mean, I had some thoughts about it. I mean, you're sort of painting a world with these little pictures of putting, I mean, if you put them all together, I think you're showing a larger. So I was wondering if you had anything like that in mind.
I do. I mean, as you could tell from the reading today, like many writers, I return frequently to my past, and my parents' lives, and my own youth and childhood. And unlike something I've got going for me that most poets don't have is I'm quite old, but I've got young kids. And most poets my age have already written their kid poems, their cute kid poems. They did that in their 30s, and that's just a distant memory for them. I'm in that phase now. I kid with my poet friends. When they were in their 30s and 40s and starting to have children, they'd write poems about how beautiful their children were. Everything about them even their diapers. So I'd start kidding them about writing what I called the beautiful diaper poem. And now I find myself writing the beautiful diaper poems, and it's come full circle. But I will end up, about every 4 years I publish a book, and I put down all the poems I've written in that year and look for a kind of general theme, which basically turns out to be, here's what's happened in the next 4 years of my life. And I have a sense, I don't know if a lot of writers do this. I've never asked this of a poet, but I have a sense of all 9 of my books telling sequentially the story of my life. So let's hope we make it to book 10. Yeah.
Your poem, I love this poem, The Forge. I love this poem. But I'm also very puzzled, and I was curious as to, it tells of a horrific incident, traumatic even, that you tell with words that are, he solved the problem. You have a way, the language does not reflect, but somehow heightens. It just talk to me about that. I think it's magnificent.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I do that often. I like the effect you can get by using the wrong kind of language for the subject. The unexpected, seemingly inappropriate language. I want the reader to be thinking, does he know what he's describing here? Like, why is he describing it that way? Why is he saying, the tricycle, the battle between the tricycle and the windshield making perfect sense on our quiet suburban street? That it's the tone which seems to suggest that maybe the writer of the poem doesn't quite know what's going on here, that somehow adds to the eerie horror of the poem. And if I were to say, I'll never forget this terrible thing that happened when my drunken father insanely drove that tricycle through the steering wheel, I don't think it would work nearly as well. I want that tone that isn't quite right, but in its jarring unrightness creates a sense of eerie chaos and unbalance and disjuncture, sort of. So I'm always, as soon as I get that tone right, I know the poem. I have fun writing the poem. I mean, this, you might say, not a fun poem, but getting that tone, getting it wrong to just the right degree, made me feel like the poem was working. And I don't know how well I answered the question there, but
I thought you're describing a kind of innocence. Innocent language in the poem for the that somehow heightens
and somewhat
for the first time kind of poem. I just was I was just saying, how did he do this? This is
thank you.
Wow. I thought it was magnificent.
Many thanks.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. While you're talking about this poem, closer, okay. While you're talking about The Forge, it's just a comment. I've started reading your Poetry Town, and so I had some familiarity with your voice and had certain expectations when I saw there was a poem by you being featured. So the poem was a shock, and it was just enormously powerful. And the comment is that I don't know how at a public reading like today, you read the things that amuse us and then you shift gear to read this without robbing this of its horror and in the surprise of it.
It presents, what I do presents its own problems, because you start building that expectation on the audience's part that something funny is going to happen. But I kind of like that sense that the audience is a little uneasy about what to expect and needs to be paying attention. I vary my tone throughout the poems in my books, and very intentionally. But you're right. I am usually, I don't remember if I did that today, but if I'm going to read that poem in the context of a series of kind of funny poems, I will say, this is not a funny poem. And sometimes that doesn't even work. People just want to, people are primed to laugh. And what I do, there are a handful of other poets, I think, who are consciously bringing humor into their poems. And it's a difficult thing, because if you read a very serious poem to an audience, quite often you can't tell what reaction they've had to it. They were silent during the reading, and they're silent after the reading, and you think, I hope that worked. But with a funny poem, you, the reader, I get this little surge of dopamine, this little drug rush. They liked it, they laughed. I can tell because they're laughing. And the danger is you just turn into a comedian. And I don't want to do that. I want there always to be the mask of tragedy and the mask of comedy on the stage with me. So it can be a little bit a tricky thing to manage.
If I may, I think, if I may, I think, had you just said today what you just said,
Yeah.
this is a serious poem, or this is not a funny poem, something that just altered our expectations. But you actually talked about your father before you read it.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
And I just found it enormous. I knew nothing about that background when I read this poem on Poetry Town. And so it was revealed through the language that you've used to reveal it. And it was, as this gentleman said, it was just pretty astonishing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We talked about how you can present such a poem, and I'm interested in what you had to overcome to write it.
Well, there are things that have happened in all our lives that we just don't like to think about, and don't. And one of you put it back in a corner, in a back room, a locked closet in the back of your memory, and because it's not time to write about it yet. And I wrote this poem just a few years ago, and I wouldn't have written it 10 years ago. I wouldn't have written it 20 years ago. But it's as if those incidents that are too difficult to face when you're younger, it becomes time. You know it's time. And I was sitting there thinking, I always think about that time my dad smashed the windshield, but I could never talk about it because it was right before everything in my parents' lives fell apart, and they got divorced. My mother moved from St. Louis to California, and the whole structure evaporated with that moment. And so I guess, Grace, I just knew it was okay now to write about that. But writing about it years earlier would have been painful, and in a way that wouldn't have been constructive.
Wow.
So.
I have another question. Yesterday I asked you why comedy and tragedy were alike, and you gave me an answer I really didn't expect. I wish you could say what you told me yesterday.
Yeah, Grace asked me what is my poems are filled with tragedy and comedy, and what are the commonalities between the two? And I said, for me, as a writer and as a reader of poetry, the similarity is this. When you read an audience something shockingly tragic and dark, like this poem, you get an involuntary physical reaction from them. You hear people gasp. They haven't planned to. They're not doing it to be polite, like applause. It happens involuntarily. They can't control it. In other words, it's sincere and authentic. That's exactly the reaction you get from a funny poem. It's an involuntary physical reaction to the poem that's called laughter. And getting both of those things as a reader up on the stage, you know it's working. You know the poem has worked, it's succeeded in communicating that basic desire you had when you wrote the poem in the first place. So that is the similarity I saw between them.
Wonderful answer, the
Yeah.
authenticity.
Yeah. As someone who writes a lot of criticism, it's always bothered me that whether we're talking about movies or poetry or fiction or songs or whatever, is that comedy never gets the respect that tragedy
Yeah.
gets. Even though a poem like No Problem, where you sort of exaggerate the problems of getting old, reveals something about human nature in the same way that The Forge does, and that deserves a similar kind of respect. And for some reason, we think that being something that makes us sad is more powerful or quote unquote important than stuff that makes us laugh. And I've always found that sort of bothersome. And I was wondering how you justify that the funny stuff is, it's not just comic relief, but it's as important as the other stuff.
Well, I agree with you entirely, and I know a number of the other poets who do include humor in their poems talk about this. And it kind of doubles. First of all, not a lot of people read poetry. So as a poet, you're dealing with that. It's not like a major motion picture. Then you make it even worse by being a funny poet. And Billy Collins wrote me and said, because he liked some poem I wrote, and he said, the funny poets don't win the big awards, but everyone loves them. I thought, well, I'll go for the love. But you're absolutely right. The funny poets aren't getting the Nobel Prize. The seriousness is regarded as, well, it's more gravitas. And it's a peculiar thing about the human condition, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's also, all the arts, all these different media,
Yeah.
They're trying to show something new about human nature. And you can reveal something about human nature by showing how tragic it is. But you can also reveal something by showing how ridiculous it is.
Yes, exactly. And you also think, as a writer, all of you who are writers out there, there's something you can do well as a writer. You've got this particular thing you do well. And there are other things you do that are fine, that a lot of other writers can do, but you think, I've got this little thing I can do. And for me, it's humor. And that's what, years ago, I'll mention a important personal story to me. In the year 2000, I'm 73 now, so I was around 50 or something. In the year 2000, I met with a friend who gave me a book by a poet, and he said, "Have you heard of this guy?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you got to read his book." And it's a book I'd recommend to you by a poet named Tony Hoagland. Some of you know who Tony Hoagland is, but the name of the book was a small collection of poems called Donkey Gospel. And I don't know what the title means to this day. I've probably read the book 10 times. But Tony Hoagland, his voice was serious, but inflected by being a kind of smartass. And I thought, that's how I am in real life, but not in my poetry. My masters said, you don't do that. Poetry is serious, act serious, be serious. And I started reading Hoagland's book, and I said, it's okay to do that, to let that part of my personality in. So that was a book that really changed my life as a writer. It gave me permission to be a smartass. And that is part of the human condition, right? So, yeah.
The poet Tom Dish said that laughter is just a 78 RPM scream of terror slowed down to 33 1/3 RPM.
Wow. For the younger people in the audience.
Yeah, who have no idea what I just said. Yeah.
There were these big black discs, you see, and no, that's beautiful.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, that's great. Wow.
So Tom Dish, poet and a novel other writer too, he said, laughter is just a scream of terror slowed down by by 3/4, from 78 revolutions per minute to 33 revolutions per minute.
The more I think about that, the more right it seems. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Hopefully this will come out right. Your poem brought to mind Bukowski's poem to his father. And with what the gentleman had just asked, my question for you would be, did it take tremendous strength to turn to humor? Or I imagine Bukowski might think it was cowardice.
That's a really good question. Strength or cowardice? Maybe a combination of both. But for me, laughter is a relief from the unbearable truth, and maybe I wanted the poem to enact that. It's not a statement. It's not an essay about my feelings about my father. It's a poetic way of dealing with a complicated series of emotions, and in my characteristic fashion, I present the tragic moment and put a comic spin on it. Not exactly a comic spin, but I change it to something, to a tone of voice that reflects my own complicated views toward it. So I would say it's a combination of both. I think if you had assigned me to write an essay about that incident and my feelings about my father, that would have been much harder for me. If you said, don't pull any, of your usual wisecracks here.
Right. And
So yeah, that is a question I can't answer.
well, I think you did a remarkable job, because I think that as a reader of the poem or listener, you've digested it for us.
Yeah.
So it's like the mother bird giving the digested food. And I think that's someplace that I think it's very hard to go into that space and talk about it. I think it was hard as hell for Bukowski.
Yeah.
And without making any comparison, just observing that I think ultimately to give that digested food takes strength.
Yeah, well, that's very kind of you. Thank you.
There's a phrase, I read it as a high school student, by John Kerr, who was a critic in New York City for Broadway shows, and whose wife wrote a number of, and he wrote this book on comedy and tragedy and said this that I've always marveled at, and it seems appropriate here. He said, all right, you're staging something, a comedy, they're at a distance, so you dress up someone as a little person who is in a wheelchair, crippled, and you send them down the hill, and everybody laughs. He said, but if you put a real person who is in pain in that wheelchair and send that real person, it's even funnier. And somehow the reality, when you are ready for a reality, it becomes more real and less traumatic. I've never figured it out, but I thought it was a wonderful way, a wonderful truth I'd never heard and never heard since.
That's beautiful. I remember, and oddly enough, I don't know who said this, and I've never even looked it up on Google. Have you heard this expression that I remember from my undergrad years? Life is a comedy for those who think, a tragedy for those who feel. But since we both think and feel, it's a comedy and a tragedy for all of us. But I'm also drawn to that old formula, tragedy plus time equals comedy. And you need time to pass. But yes.
Thank you. I enjoyed everything.
You have a great hat.
Oh, thank you.
To know that.
I love the poem on aging as well. I thought it was brilliant. And the reason I brought that up was because in both those poems, I for me, just for me, I saw a deterioration of character or person, and yet at the same time, a compassion for that character or person, what was becoming, what had been.
Yeah.
What I love about this poem is I feel it's also, for me, about right-sizing the situation. There you have this child and this tricycle, but this amazing, this fragrance of scotch. It's just the anvil, I think, the amazing way that you put like an ethical territory on such an unethical occasion.
Yeah.
And I believe that these are the most profound moments in our human life, the ones that aren't necessarily recorded parables, but they strike such a blow that it's kind of breaking a horse's. And so throughout all of that, you came forward with this amazing, graceful commentary.
I wish you'd just go on.
I loved it. Thank you.
No, that is such a kind comment. Thank you. Thank you so much. That poem, many of you in this room are fiction writers, essay writers, poets. If you're a poet dealing in those short forms, you know that every now and then you get lucky. And I was writing the draft of that poem when I was halfway through it when I thought, his hitting that windshield, it's like something. It's like what's it like? It's like a blacksmith. Yeah. And then that image came. So it's like probably most of us who have written poems we like, it happened. It wasn't that I got inspired and said, it just occurs to me that my father is like a blacksmith. No, it's in the process of writing that you discover where the poem will go, and you just have to follow it. That this poem wants to be about how your father is like a blacksmith, hammering into shape his own failure. And so it was a gift from the mysterious gods that govern such things. So thank you.
I enjoyed everything too. You started by saying if this poet got to the forefront and said, I'm going to read 3 poems and this is Dante. And, horrors. I'm going to have to sit through that. I was thinking at the end, after hearing you, I could sit through it easily because it's a divine comedy. And I was thinking of Shakespeare's Macbeth. I think you do sit through that sometimes, and you do say, oh no, is this ever going to end? And I think we know the reality is truly tragedy does end in a divine comedy. I mean, people of faith, but yet to my friends who aren't, I will say the tunnel does end. Yes, I could gladly sit through Dante reading the Divine Comedy because of the great wedding at the end.
Yeah.
That's all. And so
Well,
I think humor is very important.
I'm not going to read it for you if that's what you're...
But I'll do it someday. No, but humor is so important.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And my friends, and I'd love to talk more about comedy, but one of my friends said, if there's anyone who's going to write about the humor of God, it's me.
Yeah.
Let's
That's
do
right.
it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again.
This was a perfect way to start a holiday. I'm really very high on George Bilger. His authenticity, his compassion, his humanity, his humor. So we are going to have a book signing right across the street at the bookstore. It's a beautiful little bookstore. You should go and just look at it. And he has 2 books there, the recent ones, Central Air and the Cheap Motels of My Youth, which just won this national award and readers. No, you didn't get that one, Esther?
We have Central Air, Blood Pages, and Imperial.
Well, that's great. You have 3. But even better. So you can follow us over, and May 3rd is our next reading with Kelsey Hennigan and 2 St. John's graduates, recent graduates who are now MFA in poetry candidates. So follow us to the bookstore. Wait, one more thing.
Just one more thing. On that day, May 3rd, St. John's is having the Day of Classics. So if you wanted to go to their Day of Classics, there's a postcard over there, and
End up here
it will end up here
at 2 o'clock.
in the conversation room. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I guess just as an image, my father was a businessman, and I grew up in a